Guess we can start, huh? Okay. I'm Patricia Cervenka from Marquette University Law School in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and this is
Glen-Peter Ahlers, Barry University in Orlando.
And we're really looking for this to be an interactive discussion.
We're going to talk about, Tricia mentioned that we sent around the site evaluation questionnaire. This is questions that the ABA will be asking this year of schools that are getting their sabbatical visit. We're hoping that discussing some of these and what's going on in your school will whet your appetite, because we also want to discuss the ABA is looking at revising the standards for library and information. Start looking at that this summer. But we just thought that CALI was an excellent place to get a dialogue going. The ABA wants to know what the standards should be. And this is an excellent opportunity for us to discuss it. We're not going to solve the issue. We're not going to have just a set notes to give to the ABA, but we do want a discussion, and the ABA wants to hear from us to say, what is it that we, how is it that we can describe an adequate information infrastructure in our law school? How do we know in law school how to?
Okay. And so, if you'll notice, the first thing that these questions do, they refer back to 701 and 601C, and when you look through 701, that's it. So the standards don't really say much. So it's sort of an effort already trying to flesh out what it should be about. So if you have suggestions for wording, raise your hand. I'm going to come over to you with the mic, and let's get something going about. Obviously, that statement doesn't say much for technology. So, and 601C has a little bit more, but they're referring these questions back to 701, and that's really not much of a basis. Mm-hmm. 601C, a law school shall keep abreast of contemporary technology and adopt it when appropriate. Okay, you see the problem. And Glenn is the representative going back to the ABA in August.
Yes.
So this is your opportunity to get those comments in.
Have you seen these questionnaires before?
This newest.
Do you see it when it comes to your school for site evaluations? Haven't seen these, but anyone else seen them at all? Any time at all? One, two? It is all up on the web. It is all up on the web.
Right.
These are up on the web.
Right, but do people look there? Does the technology section of the law school get involved in the self-study? Do they really ask them, for all the...
Participating in the self-study.
Yeah, the question is, does your dean care what you say? That's the question.
Well, does the dean ask?
I have a question. We're being inspected in September, and that with new draft site evaluation,
Right.
evaluation forms. Are you all working? Is the committee working together? Or is this like different groups doing this at the same time,
Yeah,
or is it?
the questionnaire now is done, and these questions that you have in front of you are the new questionnaire. Those are up on the web page. It is a separate process. The review of the standards is a separate process.
But I'm saying that there's the site evaluation questionnaire that you have to fill out.
Correct.
For the ABA. Is the same group that's dealing? Are they both on the same page and trying to deal with this? Because we got a draft that would tell this is probably what it's going to be, but we've got to fill out the draft even though it's not the final form. And I just wonder, I'm wondering procedurally how this is all working.
And
Well-
David said that these are the ones that are going to be used this year. So even though they say proposed on them,
That's what they. Okay.
These are the ones you're filling out this year, and the standards review really isn't going to start until August. Well, does that do it? What kind of standards?
Those not in the room, I'm quite sure. It's a tough standard because, or it's tough to create specifications here that tell people enough to know what they need to do, because it is, and no doubt is going to be for some time to come, a moving target or a set of moving targets. You can't get too specific. You're going to have to rewrite them every 6 months.
Right.
But you can't be, I don't think you can be quite as vague as the existing one, because, my definition of appropriate is very likely to be different than some other school's person's definition of appropriate. So where do you find the middle ground?
And that's exactly the question, because to be a standard, it has to be measurable. And yet, we don't have to be doing the same things. And in libraries, for years, we've been counting books or counting this or counting that, and we couldn't even agree on how to count all the time. And now we're not even talking counting. Now we're talking about, wireless. How do you measure that?
And one example of an area where one could try to design standards, but again, that doesn't answer the question, is when it's appropriate, would be, for example, what kind of technology support is provided by law school staff, if any, versus what kind of technology is provided by central campus if you're part of a university, whereas if you're an independent school, clearly you're either providing all your own or getting outsourced service from somewhere.
Well, let's start there, for example. Does it matter if the support is coming from campus? Does it matter if the support is in-house?
Matters to me, but whether it should matter to the ABA accreditation process, I'm not sure.
No, I agree with you. It matters to me, because I certainly, if I've got my finger on the pie, I can make things happen. But what do others think?
Well, sometimes when you have a centralized technology infrastructure in a campus, you can realize, economies of scale, and and get licenses cheaper. For example, when you negotiate those really good deals with Microsoft, because you have many more students than just the law school included. In our case, our students get, Microsoft Office for $30, for example, and the operating system for $40. And that's because campus is a very viable force in negotiating deals for us. And in addition, we have a better license of Blackboard than we would if we were to acquire it ourselves. But at the end, it depends on whether our particular issues, for example, we use Blackboard for exams. And in law school, exams are this particular piece that's a critical path that you cannot avoid. For the medical school, that's not necessarily the case. So our requirements from them in terms of maintenance and in terms of leaving that system up during critical times are different than those of the medical school. So those are the things that we're grappling at the University of Maryland that have something to do with this idea of campus versus our own infrastructure.
Right. On the library side, some of the library questionnaires, right now we're still talking about counting things, and one of the questions we have is, if we have an electronic resource, why does it matter if I buy it in my budget or the university library buys it, if it's available?
Would you bring up 602 so we could see what it says about library administration and see how we would apply that to IT administration? Because if you were to take A, which is, it says, the law school shall have sufficient administrative autonomy to direct the growth and development of the law library, which I think in its implementation is that at most of the 180-plus accredited schools, the library director does not report to the campus library, but rather reports directly to the law school dean.
Right.
If you were to extend that parallel to IT, in general, you would not have your IT staff as part of the central campus. And so, if you think that's not the way it should go, then you would not want an IT standard to track this standard exactly.
I agree. And I agree, and I think the law school's got to have the autonomy to get done what it needs to get done. But I'm just trying to, I know Chris Abel is here. He walked in from Arkansas, a school that I know a little bit about. for example, the IT folks, they're in the law school, work with the law school, but a very good connection with the campus
Sure.
that provides some services.
Sure.
Chris, can you comment on that, or?
If you don't have the resources within the law school, then it's not a bad idea to take advantage of whatever you can do. Or if, even an outside contractor can provide services for you better than, say, your campus can. I don't see why, as long as you get the level of service that you're looking for, you couldn't, you might have to take advantage of it sometime.
I do agree that the law school's got to be calling the shots. And if campus cannot provide what the law school needs the way the law school needs to provide it, the law school's got to provide it. I think that's the common ground that I'm.
Well, I think even with the library, even though we report to the dean, there's been more and more cooperation with university libraries to work on things together. It's sort of a model of how you have to compromise.
I apologize for not being able to cite the particular standard, but I do remember some time ago when we were discussing distance education in particular, there is a standard that implies that you will be measured, at least as a law school, as to, particularly those that are not independent law schools. There is an expectation that you will take advantage of the infrastructure and your campus resources. And I'm assuming that's pervasive, and that includes IT, and that you will be evaluated on that on a site visit. Is that not the case?
Well, I think you're right in that the standards are, you don't have to do the whole thing out of whole cloth yourself. And if there are resources available to you, you're not going to be dinged for taking advantage of those resources. And I think the point is controlling it and making sure that you're getting it. And if the university cannot provide you with the infrastructure, whatever it may be, down in Miami at Barry, I can get them to do some great video work for me that I cannot replicate up in Orlando. And that's the way I'm going to go. And it'll be a couple of days before I'm going to have the staffing and the infrastructure to pull that off, yet I can still pull it off.
Glenn, somebody requested, because we only had 40 copies of this today, that I read what the site evaluation new questions are that go with what was with 601C was describe how the law school keeps abreast of information technology and adopts it as appropriate. So that's the only new question that follows that one. But for 701, they have 4. For those of you that don't have it, describe the administrative structure for providing information technology for all the law school functions. And when you read 701, that doesn't necessarily come out of it, so how can that translate into a standard if we're going to write it? Describe the budgetary and personnel resources available for information technology development, support, and training for law school faculty, administrators, staff, and students. Describe the technology infrastructure, hardware networks, software applications, including administrative systems, and its adequacy to support the law school programs, and describe how information technology is being integrated into the school's educational programs. So, in lots of ways these questions could lead in. Excuse me.
I could make a suggestion here. Thank you. If you look at 701 there, it says physical facilities, which have a material and negative effect on, is that the correct standard? A law school shall have physical facilities. Yeah, if you could read 701.
Inadequate physical facilities are those which have a negative and material effect on the education students receive.
Okay. What I was going to suggest is if one took a similar approach with technology and then flushed it out in the interpretations, possibly using something like these questions to guide that, and say material and negative. For example, if one were to look at those interpretations, it would be something like you can't hear in the classroom, or there are not enough seats in the library, or whatever it is, and one could sort of use that kind of model to give some examples, and then you wouldn't have to have a standard that was geared towards specific technology, which was indicated is going to change frequently.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And you also bring up the part of the situation is the breadth of what it is we're trying to get around. What does adequate technology in a law school mean? There is a point where acoustics in the room. Can you hear when instruction is going on? That's technology today. We have technology that can bring that. Can you see it? Are faculty members engaged? Are they using technology? Is the infrastructure there? Without saying what it is a faculty member should be doing in her class, but is there some experimentation going on? How do we measure that? Is that appropriate? Some of us in the room feel that not the courtroom of tomorrow, but the courtroom of today ought to be part of a law school experience. Should that be? Should we be actively creating courtrooms for students to use it and teaching them the technology that they will run into today's courtrooms when they go out and graduate? Is that part of the technology? And how do we define that? How many people have new courtrooms? Okay, there's 8 or 12 that think, what'd you do in your courtroom?
Sorry about that. We ripped out the everything that was in there and just completely scrapped it and started fresh. We put in new chairs, new tables, new designing, new sound system, new multimedia technology, everything. Podium with all the technology that a student would need to provide PowerPoint, documentation, photos, things like that.
And whose decision was it to do that?
It was our deans and the director of computing technology. We decided that that was something that we wanted to do, and then we took that to the faculty, and then we took that to the president of the university just to inform him, and then we started the money hunt for it, and then just did it.
You happy with the results?
We love our courtroom. It's excellent. Our students love it. They love using it.
Faculty do it?
Yep.
What kind of things do you do in the courtroom?
Besides having our trial and our appellate classes in there, we were able to actually to put in a movable wall to divide it into 2 classrooms so that the trial class could have a class going on one side, and on the other side we could have a regular lecture class going on. That's how the faculty use it and students.
Faculty using smart boards?
Not as much. We actually were able to incorporate a program onto our laptop that would allow them to do that without actually, because the room's so large, that it would not be really possible to put up a smart board. We just put a program on our laptop that they could touch and draw on.
I understand, yeah. We have recently revised all our courtroom facilities, and we now have an appellate courtroom and 2 trial courtrooms. And in the trial courtrooms, we've replicated a local high-tech courtroom so that our local attorneys can come in and use that space as well as our students. But I also question whether that is anything I would want to see in an ABA standard. I think we have to look at what's the mission of the school, and if students can be adequately trained by using courtrooms that are already in existence in the community and accessing those in the evenings and training on the real courtrooms that they're going to be using when they go out into practice, shouldn't that be adequate with the standards? I would hate to see standards that mandated a particular type of technology or a particular type of courtroom, because I think each institution needs to be flexible enough to meet its own mission. I am frustrated at times with the micromanagement in different parts of ABA standards. How many minutes in a classroom is completely arbitrary. People can learn outside a classroom very effectively, and why in the world do we need to clock the minutes in a classroom? And I think with technology, if we push for standards, we need to make sure that we adopt standards that are flexible enough to allow institutions to experiment in different ways to achieve their own missions, and we all have different missions.
Very good. Mike?
This may be more sort of have to do almost with Myers-Briggs types, but I think that's the wrong way to look at this is to look at the standards and work down. I think you have to look at the end product and work your way back. I mean, I've done 3 ABA site inspections, and one of the things that you learn is that ultimately I have to write a report. What I want is as much information as possible to write as good and helpful a report as possible. The great thing about the inspection is it forces institutions to do that which they loathe, which is strategic planning, at least faculties loathe. And so what it does, and I think what's happened with the site evaluation questionnaire, which I think is fantastic, is it's gone from, when I say a short answer format, to a essay. So that if you're going to be responsible, you've got to put in more detail. And the more detail works better. So if you've got a great self-study and questionnaire filled out, the team that goes in really understands what's going on and is able to ask the right questions. Then when you get that report, and then you know, however this is, and I think the mushier the better, the less numbers the better, because it's going to show up somehow in U.S. News. But it's about a self-study, and it's about what you're really trying to do is strategic planning for an institution. And I think for the people who I think it's tougher, like when I had to do the IT side of it, it's sometimes tougher to get a handle on certain things. You can hear about, you know, the sound isn't right or this isn't, you know, those kinds of. But in terms of the larger issues, you know, is there a set budget? How important is it to have some sort of a budget, you know, in place? How is that managed? Is that managed a different way? And so I think that's the way you have to think about it, is the end product that's going to be helpful. Because let's face it, we all go in there, the reason that we do this is we want to help the institution, we want to make practical suggestions, and we also realize that there's a limit about what we can do. So anything that ultimately you say, like, what your priorities are, the things that you need most, of somehow backing it up through that whole process to then where you say something like this gives us a framework within which to say we do need this. And I think it's tough because I think, like, the IT and independence and all, I think it changes. I think right now it's incredibly critical to have more connections with the university than we've ever had before because of interdisciplinary stuff. I feel much differently than I did a number of years ago. And I think that you've got to be real mushy because you don't know, and suddenly we're getting money from a university that we weren't for IT. So I love them more. You know, and so you can't have, you know, the autonomy and those kinds of things. I think you've got to water down, and you have to say, and you give the flexibility of the group to look at it and say, within this organization, within this institution, this is what's working well, this is what isn't working well. So I don't know. I mean, I think the site evaluation questionnaire is actually far more critical to look at and to use it as a mechanism to force them to write a good self-study. I mean, our faculty, our faculty's first self-study 7 years ago, one of the professor had a great sense of humor and wrote one of the funniest, silliest self-studies that you've ever seen. They threw it back at us, and thank God that they did. But faculties don't want to take this stuff seriously. They want to say, like, who are you to tell us anything? And so I think you need to have a really good form for what you want in the self-study, and I think we do a decent job. I just think it needs to be updated, and with the site evaluation questionnaire, because ultimately that's the ammunition. And when it comes time for me to write that report, I sure as hell want as much information from you as possible so that I can steal the appropriate language and put it in my study. So.
Right.
Thanks. I think one of the things we need to be really sure of the site study and in the standards is the site evaluation is a lot of description. I think, you know, describe what you do. I think there needs to be, like the library has, how do you support all the different functions in the university, not merely description. I agree with Dan, it needs to be, you know, you have the material effect on the law school, because description may sound absolutely great, but it's not working at all. So you need to have something, you know, how actuality is there adequate support?
Well, and that's the tension between standards and how do we get the job done. I know it when I see it. I walk in and we get a feel for it, we get a sense for it. As an accrediting agency in the Department of Education, the ABA has to have standards to go back to and say, you know, they're met or not. And the question is, how do you do that? Because it has to be, to use your term, like mushy, in the sense that I don't think the ABA or any of us in this room wants to tell any other person in this room how they have to do the technology. The question is, though, how do we know, and how can the ABA know and certify and tell the Department of Education that we know that whatever adequate technology exists in this law school, and it is alive, and it is vital, and it's going on. There's experimentation going on, and that's the question: how do you get around it without saying you have to have a courtroom, or you have to have two courtrooms, or you have to have whiteboards in the front of the room, or you have to use Microsoft, or you have to use that. And that's what we wrestle with, is how do you define it instead of just saying, well, I know.
Perhaps in a sense, it's having taken the time to sit down and have a plan for how you are going to support the technological needs of the faculty. I mean, I've sat through the discussions where we've had to bounce the question of why should we buy all this technology if nobody's going to use it? But of course, nobody's going to use it if it's not available. It's like you mentioned wireless. I would be very hesitant to require wireless in the law schools. On the other hand, you do need to require sufficient connectivity for the students. We have students who are all using listservs who sometimes go crazy trying to find some place to check the message from their faculty member. So, I mean, that is something that's important. So I guess perhaps it would be necessary to actually expect the schools to have written plans as to how they are going to be promoting technology and how they are going to be supporting it.
If they have a plan, the plan obviously is their own plan.
Right.
It shows that they're putting at least the effort
into thinking about it and doing something about it.
So that plan could incorporate what works for that university in compliance with the central IT or anything like that.
I think looking at other accrediting bodies may give us a model to work with. The North Central Association of Schools and Colleges looks at what are your goals, what kind of plan have you developed, what were the processes that you used to develop the plan, and then how do you assess the effectiveness of the plan. And that isn't a bad model to use for technology. So.
You know, one of the best definitions of a plan I ever heard was a starting point from which to deviate, and that is really true in technology. We've put together plans that, you talk about strategic planning in IT, you're lucky to get 3 years out of it. We'll find that there's ideas that we look into that don't pan out. You look into them a year later when the technologies and the interface changes, and then they're embraced. So, really, I think what you've got here is that do they have, do they have some sort of administration that looks adequate? Do they have technology in the classrooms that seems to fit what they're doing? And there's such a diversity. I've talked to a lot of people here, and there's such a diversity of what people do, but yet it works for them. And it works good. I've gotten some good ideas. I've heard of some things people are doing that I wouldn't even attempt to do. And you also have parts of the plan that are not necessarily technical, but that go in that direction. Like 9 years ago, our courtroom, we had conduit and electrical put all over the place. The technology we wanted wasn't there, but the baseline was. So here it is about almost 9 years later, they finally got the technology of the flat screens and all the stuff's affordable. Our whole infrastructure was already there. All they had to do was put it in. So there's such a diversity there. I think keeping fairly in the generalities and just basically saying, hey, are they at least doing something? Are they at least experimenting with things and putting them in the classrooms? But when you start getting more specific, you start getting more restraintive.
Oh. All right.
I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think going back to the standards themselves for libraries, I don't think it's important necessarily whom has the obligation, but I think the law school should have it clearly set out in its administration what person within the administration has the ultimate responsibility for planning and seeing through the implementation of whatever technology plans are being implemented, because there's not going to be a plan unless there's somebody with responsibility who, one way or the other through the chain, ends up reporting through the dean, and that person's got to have a delineated responsibility, or else things will fall through cracks. So it may not be the same title or position in every law school, but every law school should have someone whom the administration has said, this is the point person for the administration of technology in our institution.
The people in the room, how many folks feel that the institution you're at, that the law school has so in some form, and you're right, that the name may change and who the person is, but it does seem like it certainly somebody from a school that doesn't.
Yeah.
Talk about what's there.
What are the problems you see when you don't have sufficient control? Somebody willing to speak to that? Or identify the school in a recording?
I guess I didn't raise my hand because we have a lot of control, and we do a lot of the administration on site in the law school. But where I don't have sufficient control is the university brings everything into the closets, all the wiring, all the infrastructure. It's just like with our wireless system now. I want it really upgraded. The university put it in. It's not nearly as important to them, our wireless system, as it is to me. So I only have persuasive power to make them come back and tweak it to the point where I want it. So it's at those infrastructure levels that they're controlling, and they don't always do it quite to the level that I see, because wireless is much more important to the law school than it is to the university. So that's one example.
Do you generally have a good relationship with them?
Yes, it's better. I've tried to really build a good working relationship, talk to them, do all that. And so we're getting more response. But in the past, there's been sort of a division between the law school and the university. The university sort of sees the law school on the side, so they take care of their main business first, and we're sort of the after point. And there's this constant battle to remind them that we're there and we need this support. And it seems like at the law school we want a higher standard than they might do at the university level. So that's sort of a struggle, too.
How many people share that a sense of a higher standard, or we want to do more? Yeah, this might be an interesting parallel to the history of law libraries going back. The argument was made 15 we wanted to do more.
I think at our school we have a bifurcation between greater support for students from the university at large and greater support for faculty programs from the law school. And I don't want to talk about, there are other bifurcations in other areas, but so it's not a matter of internal versus external controls. There are internal problems as well.
I'll preface it with our school has actually resolved the issue because we have hired a dean of IT. But for a number of years, there really wasn't a point person for IT. There were people doing it, but nothing was really being done properly in terms of planning. Everything was reactive. When there was a problem, it got taken care of. If a faculty member had an idea, it was dealt with, but nothing was proactive. There simply wasn't anybody with sufficient responsibility in a sufficiently high-level position to really do planning. And the IT folks were reporting to a man who I admire greatly, but who can use a computer for word processing. But that's about the level. I mean, he will readily admit it. He did not know what he was doing in terms of IT. So I think Ken's point is really well taken. There does need to be a specific point person who is responsible for it and who is involved with it.
I'll start talking. With the site evaluation question, I think that's a way of going back. I think it's question 3, where it says, describe the infrastructure, and then it lists hardware, software, I mean, that's a perfect example of something that I think needs to be about 4 or 5 different questions, and I think that it needs to be broken down more. Just like for the library, you have to provide a organizational chart of the law library. You don't have to for IT, as near as I can tell. I don't think so. I think that kind of thing too, because I think once again, in terms of the site inspectors, you want to be able to see and get a sense and a feel for how things work, without necessarily saying we're looking for a particular structure, as opposed to saying, wow, I don't understand this structure. How does this work? Describe to me how things get done. Just like, is it the university that has responsibility to the walls, and then it's our network, how those kinds of things. I think those questions need to be broken down more. I mean, I think it's a pain when you have to do this, but I think the reality of it is that you're helping to set the agenda, and the more questions you have to fill out, let's face it, when this comes in, the IT questions are going to go to the IT people, and they're going to say, fill it out and get back to us. So it gives you the ability to be able to sort of help direct the conversations when they come there. And I saw once, and I think that's the place where I think that there needs to be more work. And I think it could be at least doubled the number of specific questions asked in IT.
Yeah. In looking at this, at these proposed changes, it also occurs to me, and this is the thing we're grappling the most at this particular point at our school, a great deal of what we talk about when we say describe information technology and how it's being integrated into a school's educational programs is that a lot of people think that that's the child advocacy programs, and that's the paradigm we have. And when we look at the state of Maryland, I think, and I may be misquoting, 2 out of 3 recent graduates who passed the bar exam in the state of Maryland will have a grievance filed against them within the first 3 years of practice. And it doesn't take much to sort of make the extrapolation, even if it's in the hypothetical, that a lot of that will probably have to do with technology in the next couple of years, if it isn't already. Professional practice has become technology dependent. And it's not only in litigation. It's in organization, it's in client contact, it's in the expectations of clients. How do you handle things like email? And how that has changed the nature of your client relationship. The standards of care for what is secure in a network, in an office environment, how that affects the solo practitioner versus a large law firm. And what I'm perhaps not seeing here is what is it that we're asking law schools to do in terms of making sure that our lawyers are professionally trained and have the skill level, not just at the technical level, but at the theoretical and conceptual level of looking at when technology, which is changing all the time, will in fact affect the way they practice. And perhaps it's, how is technology incorporated into your legal profession course on your first or second year? And and I think that we definitely have to have a greater participation of the academic deans in order to identify these issues, not just at the IT personnel level.
Would a question like how is technology incorporated in would you say, other than your trials, how are you incorporated?
Glenn, not being real familiar with the standards, is there a standard? Obviously, most, if not all, law schools have a professional responsibility course. Is there a standard on that? No. Is there a standard for ethics professional responsibility courses? Okay, and it would be, one could argue, and then certainly at 1 o'clock in the session, that what you just said is a nice plug for what we're talking about at 1 o'clock in our session, but one could then, if you accept this, you could argue that same standard should also say, and there should be a course that talks about the integration of use of technology into professional practice, which is what we're strongly arguing for, those of us giving that presentation at 1 this afternoon. But that's just one example of something that could be added. And what Mike was talking about a moment ago, I agree with. If you look at draft question 2, that could be broken down. It says describe the budgetary and personal resources, and where you see personnel, obviously that's where it should be leading to the organization chart and the lists and names and responsibilities of the people who are providing these things, available for information technology development, support, and training.
Obviously, you have to have a law library at a law school, and it's addressed very specifically in these ABA guidelines. But there is no specific addressing of the need for IT. IT has come in through the back door, and I hear someone saying we have an associate dean of IT. I hear other people saying the librarian is in charge of IT. And so the standards don't exist and are certainly not addressed by the ABA as to the qualifications of the person that is in charge of IT and the level of responsibility within the law school. Who do they report to directly? Do they report directly to the dean? Do they report to an associate dean? Do they report to a head librarian? And so there basically are no IT standards as far as the ABA. Yes, there are standards of describe these kinds of things, but I think the structure, and we've mentioned a couple of times, show your organizational structure, but I think the structure begins at the top, and the ABA has not addressed that.
Yes, going back to what Ken on number 2 here, generally generally that's like 1 or 2 people, and this industry is only evolved in the last 10 years. So, like Karen said, it's coming through the back door, and we have an associate dean for IT now, but that's within the last 4 or 5 years. Before it was like a one-man show, and now as we add people on, it's hopefully there will be more standards, and you can come and draw a hierarchical, chart of it. But it goes back to what each law school needs and what they can do in the budgetary process. We're working on just getting a budget for IT right now. And it comes out of the law library budget. We have a new dean that started in January, and that was one of the first things. He asked for fixes around the law school, and that's what, of course, myself and my associate dean put down was when we need a budget, and not just pull it piecemeal from the library budget.
I could give one example of draft language, and at 601A, one could copy that and substitute for the words law library, information technology organization.
I would just echo that and add, it looks to me like 602 could also be changed and substitute IT for law library and basically all of 602.
What about personnel also? Our collection, we get into services, yeah. Yeah, those are the examples that you use to flush it out. Exactly. For example, in the had no email, they had no. I don't think this is a philosophical question. I really don't think. And you know, step up from that. Now there are folks that are, we talk about courtrooms. How many people use a lot of video? A lot of, you know. That's coming. I think that's something that will be more and more as the technology gets easier and easier to use. Maybe that's, you know, drive our plan and how we use it. That'll work.
Well, I'm thinking, for instance, you go into a law school where they do have email, but the email is provided by the university-wide system. Is it necessary to address with your law school students the issues of email use as related to law practice? So should we spin off to an IT department that is not university-wide, because there are issues like the library separated itself from the general university library because there were things that you needed. So our IT issues, some of the technology uses of IT, using WordPerfect, Microsoft Word, is it different for the law school student than it is for the university student?
I'm always afraid about supporting students. I think we have to do it, but that doesn't mean we need to support their laptops. I think we need to teach them how to effectively use technology to do their job, to be good lawyers. But that doesn't mean they need to know how to swap out a hard drive, and it doesn't mean that we need to swap out their hard drive for them. But I agree with Ken that we need something for our students to be prepared, and, you know, is that what they're asking for in question 2 here? You know, what type of budgetary and personnel do you have for training your students? Is that what they're asking, or is that just meaning, you know, are your students getting on your network? So it's a little vague, I guess is what I'm saying.
I'm coming to this discussion from a software training perspective, which sort of relates to what this gentleman was talking about. And I'm in the process, being fairly new on staff at my institution, of trying to get a proper training facility set up in the school. Currently there's an old study room that's been sort of vaguely converted by virtue of putting some machines in there, four machines to be precise, some 1,500 students and 200 faculty and staff, so it's hardly adequate. The room has no air conditioning and many other poor issues. It's also in the library, so when you try to conduct a training session, if you open the door in order to get a little cooler air through, you're interrupting the quietness of the library. So, and it's been quite a process getting this proposal listened to with even from my own boss in IT with any sense of seriousness. And I'm wondering, to what extent this doesn't relate to everything else that's been talked about here, or just an attitudinal thing of not realizing the criticalness of training. I mean, I was recently reading a book you might have read by William Noak talking about the influence of technology over this first part of the 21st century, and how new technology is essentially a bag of bananas that if you don't eat them straight away, it's kind of worthless. And hence training in technology is essential, ongoing, and just, continual training.
I think training is one of the things that's going to come up. And part of the willy-nilly is part of how what people need to talk about. And I'm talking staff training. How they can share information. Classroom teaching. How to practice law today. What you're going to see. Much training in these.
More of a question. When I teach law, I teach students the law as it might be today, or how to learn the law, because the law is going to change. And I don't know that it's any different for technology. We are not training people to go out and do everything that we're learning in the classroom. We're training them with a set of skills to go out and do whatever comes their way. And I think we need to keep that in mind when we talk about all the technology, because I don't know that it's any different than training them to be lawyers, and our legal curriculums are changing. We don't all do the same Langdellian or Socratic method that was done 100 years ago, clinic training and moot court training and all these other things, and I'm not sure that the technology issues are all that deviant here, and perhaps we should sort of back up and not try and micromanage them and try and give the basic skills and the how to learn.
I think training is a very interesting issue. Most of the time when I've talked to people about training, they say, well, how are you training your faculty? How are you training your students? How are you training your staff? But who's training the trainers? One thing that I've heard a lot of complaints about, not necessarily from law schools, but from other departments in a university, is that they won't send them to the off-site training things. They won't send them to the seminars and stuff like that. And I almost think this is an important enough issue, is who's training the trainers. Because, they expect somebody to sit down with a book and try and figure it out by themselves, and that's not always the best way to learn. Fortunately, I'll say this much for the Tech Law School, they have been extremely good at sending those to seminars and training. They just send me to complete my MCSE back in January. We've got off-site training places we send our people to. But when I've talked to some people, this is not always the case. And I think that should probably deserve some special emphasis, who's training the trainers. Pass the torch here somewhere.
Well, before we get away too quickly, I think your email address is in the program booklet, and your meeting is in August, which... Well, and I think that's the thing. If you get some ideas about good language, forward them to Glenn, because now you know who he is and what's going on.
Glenn, what is the final process? At what level of the ABA are they approved? Is it done by the House of Delegates ultimately, like with a committee report to the House of Delegates? Okay.
It's a long process, and it will go at least a year long, and I would suspect that they would love to be able But they'll start the process and stuff, so they'll be turning their attention to it this year.
Just a question on the structure of how this is even being reviewed. This is being presented by the library committee of the ABA?
The ABA, I'm sure they're working with other people to gather information, but one arm that's gathering information is the ABA.
Okay. Are we going to ask for a technology committee in the ABA for...
They have the information, I don't know the name of the committee, but they have.
And is this other committee involved in this process at all?
The committee will be involved in it. Not the only people that they're asking.
Mm-hmm.
Said someone